Growing up, life constantly hurled unexpected challenges my way. My early years were a chaotic blend of hardships and fleeting happiness. We didn't have much, and the neighborhood wasn't exactly paradise. Yet, despite it all, I discovered resilience and learned to cherish the small joys scattered throughout the chaos. Those lessons of survival and the value of real connections laid the groundwork for my determination later in life. As I transitioned into adulthood, those early teachings became indispensable. I hopped between jobs, always in search of stability and a sense of purpose. Relationships came and went, each one leaving behind valuable insights about trust, betrayal, and self-worth. By the time I hit my 30s, I'd gained a much better understanding of who I was and what I wanted out of life. But even with all that experience, nothing could have prepared me for the chain of events that threw me into a whirlwind, leading to a turning point I never saw coming. A scream rattled my brain as I jolted awake, a throbbing pain radiating from my scalp while sharp pin-pricks danced across my skin. My attempt to open one, I was met with a blinding light that hit like a supernova exploding behind my eyelids. The noise was unbearable, a screeching sound like cats fighting inside an echo chamber. Groaning, I muttered, "Sweet Jesus, Buddha, Shiva, someone help me out here." My stomach churned, but there was nothing left to expel. That horrendous noise finally started to take form, morphing into an actual voice. Forcing my eyes open, I managed to make out a blurred figure above me. Blinking a few more times brought some clarity, and the first thing I saw was a pair of feet. Small, polished toes and bright pink nail polish poked out from fuzzy cotton candy slippers. These feet were too petite, their nails neatly painted, and they certainly weren't attached to someone who dabbled in regrettable tattoos. The voice continued, sharp and fast, delivering what sounded like a furious lecture in Spanish. My limited vocabulary, courtesy of Sesame Street, only helped me catch scattered phrases. Something about 32 donkeys and your grandmother, though it was unlikely she was inviting me over for coffee. I realized I was sprawled on the gravel driveway in our shabby trailer park, a cloud of white dust settling around me. Pushing myself up with shaky arms, I managed to sit upright, though it made the pounding in my head worse. The feet took a cautious step back as the yelling abruptly stopped. When I looked up, I found myself staring into the fiery gaze of Maria Madcap Martinez. Draped in a pink robe, her chihuahua by her side, Maria was pointing an accusing finger at me with the conviction of a prosecutor. She had a reputation as a firestorm of rage, and most of us wisely kept our distance. Even my polite greetings had earned me a death glare in the past. Now, judging by her expression, she was contemplating whether to send me to an early grave. I staggered to my feet, brushing dust from my bare skin. The realization hit me like a slap. I was completely naked, my body covered in streaks of red, white, and green paint. A small crowd had gathered, Jim in his grease-stained overalls, Linda looking like a knockoff version of Danny DeVito in drag, and the twins, Zach and Tom, casually smirking in matching sweatpants. I reached for a fallen umbrella to cover myself as Maria's chihuahua started barking like it was auditioning for an alarm system commercial. "You scared my Toby," Maria snapped, her voice a mix of fury and exasperation. "Toby?" I asked, my head pounding harder as the words left my mouth. "She's obsessed with Toby Kebbell," Linda chimed in with a conspiratorial grin. At some point, her chihuahua tugged at her robe, causing it to gape open briefly. What it revealed was a detail I didn't need but couldn't unsee. "Never seen a naked woman before," she snapped, her voice laced with disdain. "Not one quite like you." "Nice heart, by the way," I quipped, motioning toward the distinctive grooming detail that had briefly been on display. Maria slammed her robe shut, her expression shifting to disbelief and indignation. "Clean your vomit out of my rose bushes, you idiot," she barked, cutting off whatever response I might have had. I glanced down and grimaced at the mess I'd apparently left behind. "I'll take care of it this afternoon," I said, though I didn't sound convincing. "Yeah, right," Maria muttered, storming off. Her robe fluttered dramatically behind her, briefly exposing more than she intended before she disappeared into her trailer. The crowd began dispersing, their entertainment for the morning complete. Only Jim and Linda lingered. "She's something else," Jim remarked, scratching his beard thoughtfully. "Oh, give it a rest, Jim. She's young enough to be your daughter," Linda said, shooting him a withering glare. "And that's exactly what makes her interesting," Jim replied with a grin. Linda rolled her eyes. "You're a hopeless pervert." "Guilty as charged," he said, still gazing after Maria. Dragging myself toward my trailer, I paused and asked Linda, "Is it Sunday?" "Yeah, why?" she replied, her curiosity piqued. "Good. At least I'm not late for work." I glanced down at the bold letters painted across my chest, Mexicano Honorario. Shaking my head, I muttered, "Carlos is a dead man." Once inside my small trailer, I retrieved the spare key from its hiding spot under a flower pot. The interior was as sparse as always, 2 lawn chairs, a milk crate doubling as a table, and a thrift store radio. I threw on a pair of shorts and grabbed a bucket to fetch water for Maria's rose bushes. No way was I going to risk asking to use her garden hose. I spent the remainder of the day waging war against my hangover with an arsenal of water and Tylenol, setting an alarm before collapsing into unconsciousness. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, I was already waiting at the gate when Carlos pulled up in his beat-up school bus. Grinning as if he hadn't left me for dead, he leaned out the window. "Hey, Joe," he called cheerfully. "It's Jacob, you idiot," I shot back, glaring. "Nah, man, it's Jake now. Remember? Honorary Mexican," Carlos said, smug as ever. "Yeah, thanks for the reminder. Did you really need to use a permanent marker?" I replied, still feeling the tequila coursing through my veins. Carlos chuckled and added, "You had a sombrero. That was classy." I climbed into the bus, still scowling. "You left me at the gate, completely naked," I accused, taking the seat behind him. Carlos shrugged, unbothered. "You had a sombrero," he repeated, as though that excused everything. "I woke up in Maria's garden," I grumbled. Carlos smirked. "Is that a metaphor? Because waking up in someone's garden sounds like a win." Shaking my head, I clarified, "No, her actual rose garden. I threw up all over it." Carlos winced theatrically. "Man, you're lucky to be alive. Maria has a temper. Did you know her ex cheated on her? She stabbed him and the mistress." "She's not someone you mess with," he explained. "Why'd you do that to me anyway?" I asked, my irritation not yet spent. Carlos grinned as if the answer was obvious. "Honor, man. You're the first gringo crew boss who doesn't treat us like thieves." I shook my head. "We're harvesting corn. What is there to steal, Carlos?" He snorted. "It's Jesus, not Carlos. And you've got common sense, which is rare around here," he replied, clearly enjoying himself. Although I held the title of crew boss, Carlos essentially ran the operation. I was just there to pick corn and stay out of trouble. "You could run this yourself," Carlos suggested, glancing back at me. "No thanks. I need you to take the blame if anything disappears," I replied. Laughing, he translated this to the rest of the crew, who found it hilarious all the way to the fields. 3 hours into the grueling 14-hour day, my parole officer, Mr. Stewart, decided to show up. "Jacob," Stewart sneered, stepping out of his car with all the warmth of a rattlesnake. "Just checking to make sure you're actually working." "I'm here," I said flatly, fighting the urge to roll my eyes. "A miracle. You know the difference between a parolee and an inmate, right?" "Just one mistake, and you're back inside," Stewart said, his grin smug and patronizing. Keeping my voice steady, I replied, "I'm meeting all my conditions. I'm working, I'm clean, and I'm not involved in anything shady." Stewart ignored me, glancing toward Carlos, who was pretending not to understand English. "You've had 3 jobs in 6 months. Now you're working with this crowd." His tone made it clear he wasn't impressed. "I lost those jobs because of you," I shot back, finally losing my cool. Stewart smirked. They needed to know what kind of loser they'd hired. "Anyway, time for a pill test. You've got 2 hours to get to the center." My stomach sank. "I don't have a car, and it's nearly 2 hours away," I argued, but Stewart shrugged. "You know the rules. Fail or miss it, and you're back inside." He chuckled as he walked off, leaving me fuming. Carlos appeared beside me, watching Stewart's car disappear in a cloud of dust. "You sure you're not Mexican, Jake?" he joked, clearly trying to lighten the mood. I sighed. "Pretty sure. Unless Mom had a fling with the gardener," I quipped. Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Might want to check. That guy wants you on the other side of a wall." "I'll ask my mom next time I call," I said sarcastically. "Meanwhile, I need to get to the test center." Carlos nodded. "Alejandro will drive you." "I can't train a new crew boss," he said firmly. Alejandro, who didn't speak a word of English, got me there with 15 minutes to spare. I clung to the seat the entire ride, discovering it was possible to drift a bus through heavy traffic. On the way back, Alejandro talked non-stop, and while I appreciated the effort, my Spanish vocabulary didn't extend far beyond numbers, colors, and a few choice insults. Dinner that night was at a picnic table with Carlos beside me. Saturday night, Carlos began, "You started telling me how you ended up here but passed out before finishing." "There's not much to tell," I replied, trying to downplay it. "The SEC investigated my firm. I didn't think it involved me, but I was locked out. Turns out there was insider trading through a fake account I had access to. They couldn't prove I was involved, but they revoked my Series 7 license anyway." Carlos frowned. "And that's why you went to jail?" "No, that came later. During the investigation, they found cocaine in my car. It wasn't mine, but I couldn't prove it. They used it to pressure me about the missing money, tens of millions. I got 3 years but only served 6 months because of overcrowding." Carlos leaned in. "Are you sure you didn't take the money? If you did, I've got a cousin who can hide it for you." I laughed bitterly. "If I had millions, I wouldn't be here. I'd be in Mexico." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "So where'd the drugs come from?" "My guess? Planted. I used to pick up high-end clients from the airport. One of them must have left it in my car," I explained. "Everything fell apart after that. My wife stuck around until I was sentenced, then divorced me and took our savings." Carlos shook his head. "What a saint." I shrugged. "I drowned my feelings in cheap tequila. It helped. She works for the same company, though, so she got lucky. Didn't even lose her job." Carlos smirked. "True love conquers all, huh?" "True love doesn't pay the bills," I replied. "I used to make almost $500,000 a year. Now I'm barely scraping by, and she took everything." Carlos tilted his head. "Can't you get it back?" "She's an accountant. Good luck finding hidden money without lawyers, time, or cash." "Maybe someday, but not now," I admitted. Carlos sighed. "I've seen your paycheck. It's going to be a long time before you're suing anybody." Despite my better judgment, I let Carlos convince me to go out again that Saturday. "You need to loosen up," he insisted. I groaned, like last week, when I wanted to die on Sunday. Climbing into the back seat of Carlos's ancient Pontiac, I resigned myself to another questionable adventure. "This time, we're going somewhere fun," Carlos promised. "I thought that was your favorite bar," I said. "It was," he replied with a grin, "but they didn't appreciate us enough." "Did we get thrown out?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. Carlos smirked, leaning casually against the bus. "Maybe," he replied, his tone light as if being kicked out was just part of his charm. "Wasn't that your cousin's bar?" I pressed, narrowing my eyes. "Distant cousin," he corrected with a shrug, his grin widening. "Besides, this next place has dancing." We pulled into a parking lot that vibrates with bass from inside the building. The neon lights painted everything in shades of blue and purple. As I stepped out, I glanced at Carlos. "A salsa club? Isn't that Caribbean?" He waved my question off like it was irrelevant. "Does it matter? This place is crawling with gorgeous women wearing barely anything." I had the line of people waiting to get in and muttered, "You can dance, right?" Carlos snorted. "Of course. It's easy. Just move your feet and don't look like an idiot." "Well, I can actually dance," I replied, catching him off guard. His eyebrows shot up. "Seriously?" "Yeah, seriously. I know how to waltz, tango, foxtrot, salsa, jive, you name it. Back when I was married, Julia and I went to dance clubs all the time," I explained. Carlos's grin widened. "Thank God. I thought we'd get tossed out again tonight." I laughed. "I'll even buy your first beer." "Domestic, of course," I added, smirking. "You're too cheap for imports." The club was alive with energy, a pulsating rhythm that made the walls seem to vibrate. It didn't take long for Carlos to dive headfirst into the action, disappearing into a sea of people. 2 bachelorette parties and 3 divorce celebrations had the crowd buzzing, with more women than men packing the dance floor. I barely had time to take a sip of my beer before a group of women dragged me onto the floor. There was the bride-to-be, several bridesmaids, and even the bride's mom, who was surprisingly agile for her age. Dancing with her was like dodging landmines. I wasn't sure if she was trying to keep up with the beat or test my reflexes. Eventually, I managed to break away, returning to the table to find Carlos nursing a drink. "The mother of the bride?" I asked, amused. He groaned. "Man, she's a cougar in every sense of the word." I thought I was going to lose my pants. I took a long sip of my Modelo and scanned the crowd. The dance floor was packed, a swirling mass of bodies and flashing lights. My gaze caught on a woman standing by one of the tables. She was wearing jeans so tight they might as well have been painted on. Her every movement was hypnotic, like a siren calling sailors to their doom. My heart, and other parts of me, responded in kind. Carlos followed my line of sight. "Damn, he started, but his words trailed off as the woman turned. My stomach dropped. It was Maria. Her sharp eyes locked onto me like a predator spotting prey, and she started making her way across the room. Carlos raised his hands in surrender. "Hey, I just got here. Don't blame me for anything," he called out, his voice carrying over the music. Maria ignored him entirely, her attention fixed squarely on me. Stopping in front of me, she planted her hands on her hips. "What do you think you're staring at, you pervert?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the music. Before I could answer, a giggling bridesmaid stumbled into our table, dragging the bride along. "He hasn't danced with her yet," the bridesmaid insisted, grabbing my arm. Maria glared, but I was already being pulled away. "I'll be back," I mouthed helplessly as the bride's friends whisked me away. The bride seemed less enthused about the game than her friends, but I tried to be a gentleman. After a few songs, I attempted to return to my seat but was intercepted again, this time by another bride, her maid of honor, and a striking trans woman who danced with a grace that made everyone else on the floor look clumsy. She saved me from the cougar, which I silently thanked her for. As I finally made my way back to the table, a hand grabbed mine, pulling me back onto the floor. Maria stood there, glaring at me, though the fire in her eyes seemed to have dimmed slightly. "Were you ever planning to come back to your table?" she asked, her voice sharp but less biting than before. "I tried," I said with a shrug. "But my beer's probably warm by now." She smirked. "No, I drank it. I was waiting for you to come back and apologize." Any intention of apologizing vanished as I replied, "If you didn't want people staring, maybe don't wear jeans that tight and bend over tables." Her lips tightened, and her eyes narrowed. "That wasn't for your benefit, you creep." I grinned. Didn't see a reserve sign on it, and trust me, I looked closely. To my surprise, she chuckled, shaking her head. "Carlos says you're not as much of an a-hole as I thought. He didn't tie me down and force me to drink, but he did paint me and leave me naked," I replied, trying to sound indignant. "I didn't expect you to come back and clean up the roses," she admitted. "Dragging buckets around with a hangover must have been hell." I shrugged. "You could have told me it wasn't necessary." The song ended, and she walked back to her table, throwing a glance over her shoulder. Catching me watching, she smiled and mouthed, "Pervert." I winked. She rolled her eyes but smiled as she sat down. Carlos studied me as I returned. "Looks like you made it out alive," he said, impressed. "She's your cousin, right?" I asked. Carlos nodded. "Second cousin. And yeah, I said a few nice things about you." "You're welcome." The next week was unusually quiet. I managed 6 straight days of work without incident and avoided hangovers for 2 Sundays in a row. Life was good. Too good. We were heading back from the fields one evening when Carlos pointed toward a restaurant. "Hey, isn't that your parole officer? Who's the blonde with him?" My stomach dropped as I recognized Julia. Her blouse was unbuttoned far too much for a friendly lunch. "That's my ex-wife," I muttered, my voice tight. Carlos frowned. "What's she doing with that guy?" "I don't know, but it's not good," I replied, dread creeping up my spine. Carlos pulled over, called Jesus from the back of the bus, and asked him to investigate. "Jesus knows your P.O. Let's see what he can find out," Carlos said confidently. Jesus returned later with troubling news. Julia was all over him, trying to get him to do something. "She was definitely working for him," he explained. "Maybe she's asking him to go easy on me," I said, though I didn't believe my own words. Carlos shook his head. "No way. If she wanted that, she wouldn't need to seduce him. This feels like something else. The truth hit 2 weeks later when my PO, Stuart, showed up at the trailer park and tried to plant drugs in my home. Maria confronted him in her pink robe, standing her ground while the neighbors watched. I barely had time to step off the bus before she shifted her focus to me. "Did you give him permission to go into your trailer?" Maria demanded. "No, and he can't without reasonable suspicion," I replied, glaring at Stuart. When I pressed him about Julia, his face went pale. "Your ex-wife wants you back in prison," he said, his voice strained. "Watch your back. She'll do anything to make it happen." Maria moved closer as Stuart drove off, her expression softening. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, her hand steadying me. I shook my head. "Not really," I admitted. "She hates you that much?" Maria asked, incredulous. "I didn't do anything." "She was the one cheating, and I didn't even know it," I said, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Maria's lips curled into a wry, almost attractive twist as she replied, "You didn't have to do anything. She might blame you for her actions. Women, you know." Her big brown eyes locked onto mine, filled with concern. "Carlos is right. You need to watch your back. She hates you that much and isn't stopping now." The thought that Julia hated me enough to destroy my life was nauseating. I turned to Carlos, my voice tinged with desperation. "Do you have any cousins in Bergman Towers? That's where Julia works." He grinned smugly. "What can I say, man? We're everywhere. I'll tell Isabel to get pictures of any visitors she gets at home too," he added. Linda, dressed in Jim's overalls, peered at the dust kicked up by Salmon's car as it vanished into the distance. "Jim and I will keep an eye on your trailer, but you should probably install a latch with a padlock," she suggested seriously. I glanced at Maria, her grip on my arm loosening. "You saved me," I said with genuine gratitude. Her expression softened before a teasing smile crept onto her face. "You spend all your time staring at my bum, so I figured I'd watch yours for a change," she quipped. Carlos rolled his eyes dramatically. "Hers is way more interesting than yours," he said, smirking. Maria didn't miss a beat. "God, I hope so. If it isn't, I'm wasting way too much time at the gym," she joked, slapping her backside for emphasis. I blinked, pulling my eyes back to hers. "Where do you work, anyway?" I asked, steering the conversation in a safer direction. "Crestridge Medical Center. I'm an LPN. The pay isn't great, but the insurance is solid," Maria replied, clearly proud of her job. I couldn't help myself. "And obviously, it comes with a great gym," I commented, earning a smug grin as she wiggled slightly. "Damn right," she said confidently. Carlos tapped his watch and nodded toward the bus. "We've got a field of corn waiting, Jake." I sighed but nodded back. "Yeah. Thanks again, Maria. You really saved me," I said sincerely. She gave me a small smile and replied, "Glad I could help. Let me know if anything happens, okay?" As she walked toward her trailer, the wind played with her robe, earning an appreciative whistle from Linda. "Wow, sop that up with a biscuit," she muttered. Jim rolled his eyes. "For God's sake, Linda. She's half your age." Linda grinned unapologetically. "Yeah, she is," she said with a satisfied nod. It took Isabel 6 days to gather photos of Julia's regular visitors. We crowded into her living room, where she displayed her findings with pride. One photo was of Nick Coleman, an accountant I barely noticed at Julia's office. I couldn't believe he had been sneaking into my home while I was at work. The other man, a blonde in a suit with a crew cut and a briefcase, was a mystery. "I don't recognize him at all," I said, shaking my head. Carlos frowned as Isabel leaned forward. "Maybe he works for your old company," she suggested, clearly enjoying her role as a sleuth. "No, I've never seen him," I replied, glancing back at the photo. Isabel's eyes gleamed with excitement. "What about your wife's office? Could he work there?" she asked eagerly. I sighed, trying to remember. I visited her office a few times, but I mostly dealt with brokers in my building. The support staff, like Coleman, worked at headquarters. I'd recognize him, though. Carlos tapped at his phone. "I've got a cousin who does security there." "Let me ask him," he said casually. I raised an eyebrow. "Of course you do," I muttered. "Your family tree must look like a small country." Seconds later, his phone buzzed. "We can drop by and take a look," Carlos said with a grin. Isabel's husband murmured something to him, earning a chuckle. "What's so funny?" I asked, puzzled. Carlos smirked. "He says we should keep investigating. Apparently, Isabel's been more energized when she gets home from work. She's loving this whole thing." I groaned, my head falling into my hands. "Please don't tell me this is some kind of weird roleplay." Carlos's grin widened. "Oh, it is. She even bought handcuffs and a fingerprint kit." "Stop. I don't want to know." "But, dear God, Carlos, stop, or I'll tell you about Jim, Linda, and the spatula," I warned. Carlos winced dramatically, holding up his hands. "Fine. You win." We arrived at a small apartment complex where Carlos led me to a green door on the 3rd floor. A towering red-haired man opened it, smiling warmly. "Jake, meet my cousin Solomon," Carlos said proudly. I blinked at Solomon, who looked more like a northerner than a cousin of Carlos's. Solomon chuckled as he stepped aside to let us in. "What brings you here?" The text sounded urgent. Carlos gestured toward me. "Jake here has a problem. Someone's trying to set him up, and he doesn't know why." Solomon studied me for a moment, then tipped his beer bottle toward me. "First off, you look more like a Jacob than a Jake. Second, I've got strict instructions to keep you out of the complex, so I hope you're not asking for any favors. It sounds like a mess. Does your ex really hate you that much?" April asked after joining us with a beer and listening to the story Carlos and I had pieced together. I shrugged, feeling the weight of the situation. "No reason for it as far as I know," I admitted. Solomon, studying the photo Carlos had shown him of the blonde man with Julia, nodded thoughtfully. "That guy's Evan Webb. He's been around your ex's building but not as much lately. Never saw him with Coleman, though. He's an SEC investigator, and he tried intimidating me when he first showed up," Solomon explained. Carlos and I were quiet on the way back to the trailer park, the implications of Julia's connections with both Coleman and Webb swirling in my mind. As we neared the gate, I couldn't help but remark, "So, not all your cousins are actual cousins, huh?" Carlos shrugged nonchalantly. "You've got the family you're born with and the family you choose," he replied, glancing at me slyly. "And Maria?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. "She's really my second cousin, but she likes you, you know," Carlos said, his grin widening. "Weren't you the one who said she might eliminate me?" I reminded him. "Doesn't mean she doesn't like you," Carlos quipped, though his grin faded as he asked, "What are you going to do?" I sighed, unsure. Julia seeing the SEC guy is an ethics violation, but I'd rather just leave it alone, I admitted. Carlos frowned. "But she won't leave you alone. Don't do anything stupid. If you need help, I'm here," he offered sincerely. I nodded, still unsure, as he drove off and I walked through the dimly lit trailer park. "Hey, pervert!" Maria's voice called out, drawing my attention to where she sat outside her trailer. "Hey, Maria," I greeted her, trying to mask my weariness. "Bad day?" she asked sympathetically. "Yeah. Everything I thought I knew about my wife is nonsense," I replied, my frustration leaking into my tone. She held up a bottle with a teasing smile. "Need a drink?" "Patio from Jalisco," she offered. I approached cautiously, protesting, "That's the good stuff. Don't waste it on me." Maria smiled warmly. "I've been there with my ex, I can spare some," she said, patting the chair next to hers. "You promise to let me know what's going on." Sinking into the chair, I took the bottle from her hand, noticing there were no cups. "Tequila eliminates germs." "You won't catch my cooties," she joked, watching me take a swig. "I'm more worried about you catching my bad luck," I muttered before launching into the full story of Julia's years-long betrayal. Maria leaned forward intently, her feet tucked beneath her. "So, it looks like Julia has been setting you up for years. She was with the SEC guy over a year before the investigation and Coleman 2 years before that, right? And now she's trying to get Salmon to put you back in prison?" Maria asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "That's about it," I replied. "How long were you married?" she asked softly. "Just over 4 years," I answered, feeling the ache of those wasted years. "So, she was with Coleman practically from the beginning," Maria noted, her expression turning grim as she mulled it over. After a quiet moment, she tilted her head. Think she married you just to set you up? She asked bluntly. The thought made me feel even worse. That idea sucks more than tequila on an empty stomach, I admitted. Maria took the bottle, sipped, and handed it back, her gaze thoughtful. Manipulating men is what some women do best, she remarked, her voice edged with bitterness. So, what are you going to do, get revenge? I shook my head and replied firmly, I just want out of this, but that doesn't seem to work. Maria held up the now empty bottle, then stood. Maybe another bottle will help you think it through. I think I have one inside, she said, walking to her door. As she opened it, the light seemed to dissolve her robe, and she glanced back with a sly smile. You coming? She asked. Entranced by the sway of her hips, I followed her inside, where she gestured toward the open door of her bedroom. The bottle's in there, she said, her voice teasing. I stepped closer, but as I did, Maria turned, her robe falling open as she grinned wickedly. Pulling her into my arms, I kissed her, and she responded by hooking a leg around me and shrugging off her robe completely. I warned you, she murmured, her smile widening. Manipulating men is what some women do best. Hours later, as Maria lay half across me, she smiled lazily. Wow, you must have been saving that up. I'm a little tender, she teased, glancing at the floor. I'm throwing that pillow away. I laughed softly. Yeah, washing won't help. She chuckled. I'll just buy a new one, she said, running her fingers through my hair. Not much of a social life these days, huh? She asked knowingly. You didn't hook up with that cougar at the club? Nope, I replied, amused. Maria grinned. I know you didn't. I was keeping an eye on you. I raised an eyebrow. Fair, since I had an eye on you too, I said, laughing. She sighed. I lied, you know. That whole thing at the club? That was for your benefit, she admitted, her voice softening. She paused, then added, I need to tell you the truth. I knew you'd be at the club. That's why I went. I groaned. I'm going to kill Carlos. Maria laughed. He didn't know. He just asked for a good spot, so I decided to show up, she explained. Why? I asked, genuinely curious. Maria shrugged. Because I needed to stop being a witch. I've been angry since my ex-husband, and I thought you might understand. Besides, I got a good look at you before you grabbed that sombrero, pervert. She giggled. So you wiggled your bum at me on purpose? I asked, smirking. It worked, didn't it? You drooled over me every time I went outside, she teased, her eyes twinkling. Is that why you wear that robe? I asked. Maria smiled coyly. Sometimes. I'm a bit of an exhibitionist, and you found my weakness, she admitted as I squeezed her hip. A sudden knock interrupted us. Maria threw on her robe while I got dressed, and when she opened the door, she looked puzzled. This girl needs to talk to you, Maria said, stepping aside as April walked in. Got a minute, Jake? April asked hesitantly. Maria stays, I said firmly, motioning her to join us. Okay, but this doesn't go to Solomon, April said with a sigh. She sat down, her tone nervous as she started to explain. When the circus went bankrupt, I was stuck. I started street performing and got into some small cons, like 3-card Monte, she admitted. I raised an eyebrow. Solomon said you did street magic, I said. It's the toughest kind, just you and the marks. No stage, no assistants, she replied with a grin. What does that have to do with all this? Maria asked, clearly confused. April exhaled slowly. I heard about bigger cons and helped a couple. Solomon thinks he rescued me before I got in too deep, and mostly, he did. I didn't do anything really bad, but being broke in the city sucks. I don't want to tarnish what he did, he doesn't deserve that, she said, her voice heavy with guilt. Maria smiled gently. I get it, she said softly, her tone reassuring. April gave her an exaggerated wink before turning to me. I think you're looking at this the wrong way, she said bluntly. Why? I asked, confused. Because you're wondering why they're targeting you. This is just another big con, and you're not the mark. You can't be, you don't have anything worth taking, April explained. Then why set me up? Why try to put me back in prison? I asked, growing frustrated. April leaned forward. You're not the mark. You're the distraction. They want everyone focused on you so no one's looking at them, she clarified. Maria frowned. So how do we stop it? April grinned. Simple. Convince the mark they're being conned, she said with a smirk. Suddenly, everything clicked in my mind. Damn it, I'm an idiot, I muttered. Maria raised an eyebrow. Why? She asked, puzzled. The Martinique. We were supposed to go to Fiji for our honeymoon, but Julia changed it at the last minute. She sent me deep-sea fishing one day while she stayed at the spa. I bet she set up an account there in person so there'd be no trail, I explained, the pieces finally falling into place. Maria leaned closer. Isn't there anyone you can call? She asked. The SEC has a reporting mechanism, but that'd just tip them off, I said bitterly. Maria smiled slyly. Why not both the DOJ and the FBI? The FBI and IRS have fraud reporting websites, she said. I nodded, her suggestion sparking hope. The next day, I used the library computer to file anonymous reports, hoping to cause enough trouble to keep Julia and her allies off my back. In the meantime, I stayed quiet, reporting to Stuart and working with Carlos until the harvest ended. Afterward, I found a job making donuts, which was easier and less stressful, though I missed the old crew. The hours matched Maria's, and soon we were practically living together. Life was good, but I should have known it wouldn't last. One evening, as I nuzzled Maria's neck and grabbed her hip while she set the table, a harsh knock echoed through the trailer. Maria glared at the door, her breathing uneven as we braced for yet another disruption. When I opened the door, half expecting Jim to be there asking to borrow my robe again, I was instead met by 2 deputies and a pair of men in suits, their presence making my stomach churn. I recognized the deputies immediately, but it was the older man in plain clothes who held up his badge and said, Jacob Phillips? I'm Special Agent Sanders with the FBI. We need you to come to the field office to answer a few questions. Before I could respond, Maria clamped onto my arm, her voice sharp as she demanded, Are you arresting him? Sanders shook his head. No, ma'am, we just need to ask some questions. I turned to Maria, knowing resistance was pointless. I probably need to do this, I murmured. She reluctantly let go, but not before snapping pictures of the agents with her phone and whispering something in rapid Spanish to one of the deputies, whose face paled as if she'd just cursed his entire bloodline. As I was driven away, I caught sight of Jem and Linda heading toward Maria's trailer. At the FBI field office, I was led to a sterile interview room, white walls, gray carpet, and a dull table that screamed government efficiency, and left to wait. After 20 minutes, a clean-cut man in a black suit entered, set his credentials on the table, and introduced himself as Senior Special Agent Carl Rivera from the FBI's Cyber Response Branch in D.C. We received your tip and need clarification for an ongoing FBI-IRS investigation, he said smoothly. Over the next 2 hours, Rivera went over every detail of my report, asking about honeymoon itineraries, maps, and the possible Martinique account, which I suspected Julia had set up during our trip. I signed statements, reviewed documents, and maintained an icy calm despite the surreal horror of realizing I had known this man all along, Carlos, or L, or whoever he truly was. To my relief, no mention was made of Isabel, Solomon, or April. They were, apparently, protected by some unspoken understanding of loyalty. When the interrogation ended, Rivera shook my hand with robotic politeness, thanked me for assisting the investigation, and left me with silence roaring in my ears. Back at Maria's trailer, she was waiting, her concern evident as she asked, Are you okay? I ignored her question and instead asked flatly, Did you know about Carl? Her confusion was genuine. Carl who? Carlos? What about him? Is he okay? She asked, clearly alarmed. He's FBI, I revealed, watching the shock and disbelief sweep across her face like a wave of relief. Carlos? Are you serious? He told me he came out here because he had trouble in New York, she said, her voice trailing off before launching into a fiery tirade in rapid Spanish that I was probably lucky not to understand. As her anger spilled out, I briefly considered hiding under the chair with Toby, her every happy chihuahua. Maria, I interjected softly, I'm so sorry. She stopped mid-rant and blinked at me. For what? She asked, her tone confused but calmer. For even thinking you could have. I trailed off, unable to finish. She shook her head. You asked. You didn't accuse me of anything. But that liar, he lied to all of us. His family. Us. She crossed her arms, anger bubbling just under the surface. Over the following months, the fallout from Julia's schemes unraveled spectacularly. News of the arrests and trial dominated the media. The FBI-IRS investigation into SEC corruption exposed far more people than I had imagined. Julia took a plea deal, handing over the stolen offshore money and receiving 15 years in prison. Her SEC lover wasn't so lucky, he got 20 years without a plea. Most of the others involved received sentences ranging from 5 years to 18 months, including one IT guy who got off lightly. Despite the vindication, I couldn't shake my unease. Julia had drawn so many people into her tangled web, and it was unsettling to think about the extent of her manipulation. Maria, however, had only one comment about Julia: "You were married to that skinny witch. I thought you liked women with real bums." I shrugged, laughing. What can I say? I was deprived for 4 years. I'm making up for it now. Maria shot me a playful glare, though the corners of her mouth twitched with amusement. I know, she teased. I can't even wear shorts without you leaving tooth marks all over me. Her exhibitionist streak, if anything, had worsened, and she spent most of her free time lounging in her robe, which I didn't mind at all, especially since she occasionally bore the evidence of our more enthusiastic moments. Meanwhile, the court began reviewing my conviction after it was revealed that Coleman, under Julia's orchestration, had planted the pills in my car. While I didn't hold my breath waiting for a resolution, it was enough to know the truth was finally out. P.O. Stewart went hands-off, even mentioning the move to vacate my conviction. Salmon, however, retired quietly, escaping charges altogether. Maria suspected he wouldn't have gone through with planting the drugs, and I chose to trust her instincts. 4 months after Julia's sentencing, Maria and I settled into a life that felt, for once, stable. We often met Solomon and April at the salsa club, ran into them at street festivals, and sometimes grabbed dinner and drinks together. Dancing with April was always a surreal experience. Her double-jointed moves were hypnotic, and watching her perform street magic on unsuspecting patrons never got old. One evening, as Maria freshened up, I grabbed a table at the club and waved over a waitress. Just as I was about to order, Carl, pulled out a chair and sat down with a weary sigh. "I'll get this round, man." "I owe you one," he said, nodding at the waitress before turning back to me. I stared at him, my voice icy as I asked, "Carlos? Or is it Carl?" He exhaled heavily. "Carlos. And yeah, I figured Maria would be pissed at me. She's earned that." I narrowed my eyes. "You doing your job, huh?" I bought it. "I thought you were my friend." Carlos, or Carl, gave a rueful smile. "I'm good at what I do. Lots of training." Solomon told me he suspected something, though he thought I was state narcotics, not FBI, I said bitterly. Carlos leaned back in his chair. "I wasn't even here for you, you know. We had an op running, but it came up empty. When the employment agency placed you here, it was blind luck," he explained. I leaned forward, incredulous. "The FBI stocks low-level pill parolees now? What kind of crap is that?" Carlos sighed heavily as he explained, "Everyone was convinced you had the money hidden, probably 6 agencies watching, just waiting for you to make a move. Took me a while to suspect you weren't in on it." I frowned and asked, "Why didn't you say something?" He shrugged, his expression regretful. "I couldn't be sure at first, and when we learned an SEC investigator was involved, I was stuck. The rules are simple. The FBI should have been investigating, but none of our evidence was legal, and the politics were messy. We couldn't legally initiate anything." I raised an eyebrow. "But if someone lodged a whistleblower complaint, you'd have probable cause," I pointed out. Carlos nodded and admitted, "It worked, didn't it? We figured out why Julia kept targeting you after you were released. You were supposed to be the fall guy, but they didn't realize there wasn't enough evidence to fully railroad you. When you got out after a few months, the SEC and IRS stayed on high alert. Julia couldn't touch the money without drawing attention. But if you went back to prison long-term, the pressure would be off, and she'd be free and clear." I shook my head, disgusted. "That's cold," I muttered, but Carlos corrected me with a bitter laugh. "Too cold. I interviewed her, she's probably a full-blown sociopath. They're drawn to money, power, and end up in politics, law, and finance. They're cold as ice and damn good liars, convincing as hell." I snorted and said, "Kind of the pot calling the kettle black there, Carlos." He shrugged and conceded, fair enough. Still, you're lucky you're alive. She probably figured liquidating you would draw too much attention. But she did ask about you, wondering why you hadn't tried to see her or talk. My voice turned bitter as I replied, what the hell is there to talk about? She was never who I thought she was. Carlos set his beer down and explained, if she's like other sociopaths I've met, she wants to know she won in some way. She'd want to see you break down, get upset, or react when you realized you were played. Honestly, it pissed her off when I told her you screwed up her plan, cost her all the money, and got her sent to prison. That's a pretty one-sided win, don't you think? I sighed, frustrated. I wasn't trying to win anything. I just wanted everything to stop. Carlos nodded. I know, but it worked for me. Sociopaths are usually narcissists. She tried showing off how she won by explaining stuff we didn't know, which ended up putting 2 more of her co-conspirators behind bars and recovering a bit more money. Maria suddenly appeared at the table, her glare fixed on Carlos as she hissed something sharp in Spanish. Carlos raised his hands in mock surrender. I know, my mom already relayed your, opinion. I'll never hear the end of it, so thanks, he said dryly. Maria glanced between us, gripping my arm possessively as she took a seat next to me, her glare still burning into him. Carlos took a sip of his beer and then asked, what else do you want to know? I paused, then asked cautiously, how many people were involved? Carlos hesitated. Are you sure you want to know? Maria frowned but nodded, and Carlos finally answered, 10, but 2 were women, 11 if you count the IT geek who botched the frame job on you. He got caught messing around in the server room and rolled on everyone as soon as we pressured him. 18 months in prison, but he sang like a canary. I shook my head in disbelief. 18 months for some server shenanigans? Damn. Maria elbowed me with a wicked grin. Mine aren't worth that. I laughed and replied, of course they are. Carlos groaned, holding his hands up. Oh God, too much information, he muttered as Maria laughed. Things quieted after that, the joking a reminder of how close we all had been despite everything. I turned my beer bottle in my hands and asked quietly, what do you want, Carlos? He sighed. I wanted to set things right. Family, you know. I thought of a dozen bitter replies but swallowed them and said instead, are we Jake and Carlos, or Carl and Jacob? He smiled faintly and replied, Jake and Carlos, definitely. Carl and Jacob? Not so much. Maria studied him with a calm but firm expression and said, you ever do that again, and you'll regret it for the rest of your life. Her tone wasn't venomous, but the certainty in her voice left no doubt. Carlos nodded solemnly. I know. I deserve that. Thanks for giving me a chance to make things right. Maria nodded, seemingly satisfied, while Carlos finished his beer. I need to apologize to Isabel, he admitted. I talked to Solomon and April, that's how I knew you'd be here. Solomon understands, but April? That'll take time. She doesn't trust easily, but when she does, it's wholehearted. I messed that up. I nodded, understanding April's rare combination of street smarts and gentle naivety that Maria had come to admire. Carlos stood, pulling an envelope from his pocket with a hint of irony. I asked if I could deliver this personally, he said. What is it? I asked warily. It's the adjudication on the IRS reward money for reporting the tax evasion. It's not a fortune, but it should help. It's a percentage of the taxes owed on the undeclared income minus taxes and deductions, of course, but it'll get you back on your feet, Carlos explained. If they vacate your conviction, will you go back to your old job? He asked hesitantly. I shook my head. No. There will always be suspicion, and no one's going to sponsor me for a Series 7 license again. The donut shop owner is thinking about selling, though. I'm managing it now and looking into bank loans. It's affordable, and the profits are good, I said. Carlos snickered. A big-shot donut shop owner. Jesus. I smirked. You're saying it wrong. It's Jesus, and I'm not the owner yet. Alejandro and I both work there, I corrected, laughing. Carlos shook his head. Still hard to picture. I shrugged. Money is just money. I have family now, I said simply. I caught a flash of pain in his expression before he turned and walked away. Opening the envelope, I was stunned to see the total, over $500,000. Showing it to Maria, she smiled and said, No problem buying the donut shop now, and we can get you a nicer engagement ring. She studied the modest quarter-carat ring on her finger before shaking her head. No, I'm keeping this one. You worked hard to save for it, and that means a lot more. I squeezed her thigh, grinning. What should we do with what's left after buying the shop? She thought for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the window. There are a lot of empty lots in the trailer park. Maybe we could get a double wide with a big deck and have everyone over, Jim, Linda, maybe even Carlos in a month or two, she said, her voice soft but hopeful. With a barbecue grill, patio furniture, and a good stereo system, I added, imagining the scene. Maria leaned against me, her voice taking on a nervous but excited edge. Maybe we could make one of the bedrooms a nursery. You know, for the future. Her words were measured, but I heard the uncertainty in them. Smiling, I pulled her closer and said, maybe not too far in the future. Okay, we'll get a 4-bedroom. You never know. Maria sighed with relief, her teasing smirk returning. Maybe I'll be the one leaving tooth marks on your bum tonight. Laughing, I replied, pervert. She giggled, her eyes sparkling as she said, you better believe it.